In 1943, the Queen Mary carried 16,683 people in one Atlantic crossing, a record no ship has broken. But it wasn't age that doomed her. A single 1967 decision, the one that saved her from the scrapyard, is exactly why she can never be fully repaired. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that decision was and why it's still impossible to undo. Her old rival, the SS United States, faced the same fork in 2024 and is being sunk as a reef. Go back to April 2021. Naval engineer Jim Towers is inspecting Queen Mary's bilge system, finding almost nothing left. He didn't find a slow leak. He found a system that had basically stopped existing. Pipes that had been ripped out, valves that no longer worked. The part of the ship built to keep her from flooding simply wasn't there anymore. His report went to the city in May of 2021, and it used a word nobody wants attached to a vessel the length of 3 football fields: capsizing. Here's the part people get wrong. Everyone assumes the Queen Mary is falling apart because she's old. Sure, she's 90 years old, but age doesn't explain why the emergency hit in 2021 and not, say, 1985. Old ships survive a long time if somebody keeps fixing them, and if somebody can actually reach the parts that need it. That second condition is the one that quietly stopped being true. The real question was never why she's rusting. It's why nobody stopped it in time. That answer starts almost 6 decades before Jim Towers ever climbed below deck with a flashlight and a checklist. Go back to Clydebank, Scotland, at the start of the 1930s. A shipyard called John Brown and Company had just laid the keel of the largest, fastest ocean liner anyone had ever attempted to build. Then the money ran out. The Great Depression hit Britain hard enough that construction stopped completely, the half-built hull sitting exposed for more than 2 years while thousands of shipyard workers went without pay. The project only got finished because the British government agreed to loan Cunard the cash on one condition. Cunard had to merge with its biggest rival, White Star Line. So this ship wasn't just an engineering project. She was built to prove a country could still dream big in the middle of an economic collapse. She launched in 1934 and entered service in 1936, and almost immediately she did what she was built to do. She went fast. That summer, she broke the speed record for crossing the Atlantic, stealing the unofficial title from the French liner Normandy. She lost it the following year, then took it back in 1938 and held it for over a decade. In an era when speed meant prestige and prestige meant survival, the Queen Mary was, for a while, simply the fastest way to matter. Everyone thinks this is a story about a ship. It isn't, not really. It's a story about what happens when something built entirely to move is told to stop moving forever. In the 1930s, ocean liners weren't just transportation. They were the entire connective tissue between continents, before commercial flight existed as an option for ordinary travel. There was no other fast way across the Atlantic. Passengers dressed for dinner because the crossing itself was the event, not just the means to an end. Nations competed over which country's liner was biggest, fastest, and most photographed leaving harbor. Speed wasn't a marketing detail, it was the entire business model. A liner that couldn't outrun its rivals couldn't fill its cabins, and a liner that couldn't fill its cabins couldn't cover the cost of running what was essentially a floating city with its own crew, kitchens, and power plant across 3,000 miles of open ocean. Every extra knot of speed was money, which means the exact thing that made her valuable also made her expensive to ever stop moving. Then came the war, and the ship that was built for luxury became something else entirely. Stripped of her peacetime fittings painted battleship gray, The Queen Mary spent the Second World War as a troop transport, and this is where that opening number comes back into focus. In one voyage in 1943, she carried 16,683 people at once, more human beings than most towns hold, because her speed let her outrun submarines without needing a naval escort. Over the course of the war, she moved 765,429 military personnel across the Atlantic. Winston Churchill sailed on her. That's not a footnote, that's proof of exactly how much capacity and exactly how much raw physical size was packed into one hull. The same design that made her the fastest thing on the ocean also made her one of the largest steel structures anyone would ever try to keep afloat, repaired, and moored for the next 90 years. Size that wins a war doesn't disappear once the war ends. It just becomes a maintenance bill. After the war, she went back to carrying paying passengers, and for over a decade, demand held strong, at a time when crossing by sea was still the only realistic way for millions of ordinary travelers, immigrants, and returning soldiers to reach the other side of the Atlantic. Then, starting in 1958, commercial jets began crossing that same ocean in hours instead of days, and the entire industry the Queen Mary belonged to simply stopped mattering. This wasn't a competitor undercutting her on price. It was an entire mode of travel being erased in less than a decade. Nobody could outmarket a jet. Operating a ship that size costs real money, whether her cabins are full or half empty. Crew, fuel, insurance, dock fees, all fixed, all due regardless of demand. Once jets pulled enough passengers away, those costs stopped being survivable. Within a few years, transatlantic ocean liner traffic collapsed, and Cunard's chairman, Basil Smallpiece, a former airline executive who understood exactly what jets were about to do to sea travel, made the call: retire the ship. In 1967, Cunard put her up for auction in London. 18 bidders showed up, including a proposal to turn her into a floating school in New York. Long Beach won, paying $3.45 million for one of the largest ships in the world, a bargain that should have been a warning sign, because nobody sells an asset that cheap unless keeping it costs more than they think it's worth. She was too wide to fit through the Panama Canal, so her final voyage went the long way, around Cape Horn, arriving in California in December 1967. She would never sail again. That sounds like the end of the story. It's actually where the real story begins. This is where people get the timeline wrong. The popular version says the Queen Mary started falling apart recently. She didn't. The damage started the moment she became a hotel, not the moment she closed to the public decades later. When Long Beach converted her for public use in the early 1970s, at a cost of roughly $31 million, engineers altered her interior to create hotel rooms, exhibit halls, and event space, and in doing that, they compromised the watertight bulkheads that had been part of her original design, the internal walls meant to stop flooding from spreading through the hull if she was ever breached. Then she was permanently moored, no dry dock ever again. A ship is designed to be lifted periodically out of the water so crews can inspect and repair the hull from the outside. The same way a car needs to go up on a lift, not just get its oil changed while it's still sitting on the road. The Queen Mary hasn't had that option since 1967. She has sat in salt water continuously for close to 60 years, with less internal protection than she was built with, and no way to properly inspect the one part of her that actually touches the ocean. This wasn't a renovation. It was the moment she stopped being repairable in the way a ship is normally repaired, and started being repairable only in the much harder, much more expensive way a permanently sunk foundation is repaired. The pattern of operators walking away started almost immediately. Diners Club, the first company signed to help run her, backed out before she ever opened to the public, leaving the city to operate the ship directly through most of the 1970s at a steady loss. In 1980, Rather Corporation took over on a long-term lease that lasted 8 years before changing hands again. By 1992, under a new owner, a marine survey found $27 million in needed repairs. That owner was the Walt Disney Company, which had acquired the lease almost by accident while buying a nearby hotel company, and had briefly floated plans for an entire theme park built around the ship. Disney looked at the repair bill and walked away within a year. That's the first real crack in the story, not a scandal, not a disaster, just a company doing simple math and deciding a national icon wasn't worth what it would cost to keep her sound. And that pattern never stopped repeating. A businessman named Joseph Prevratil reopened her in 1993 and ran her for over a decade, until his company filed for bankruptcy in 2005. The lease changed hands again. Each new operator inherited a ship that needed more than the last one had put into her, and each new operator had every financial incentive to spend as little as possible on repairs nobody could see below the waterline, and as much as possible on the parts guests actually noticed: the restaurants, the event spaces, the wedding venues, the things that show up in a brochure. That's the trap hiding inside this business model. A hotel lease rewards whatever guests can see. A ship's survival depends entirely on what guests never see at all. This is a common trap for any public asset run by rotating private leaseholders. Nobody holding the lease today is guaranteed to still be paying for a problem that surfaces years later. So the rational move is always to defer, not repair. In 2016, a company called Urban Commons signed a 66-year lease and pitched Long Beach on something bigger: a $250 million waterfront development called Queen Mary Island. The city, hoping for exactly that kind of investment, released $23 million for 27 urgent repair projects on the ship. By 2018, all of the money was gone. Most of those 27 projects were still unfinished. $23 million sounds like a serious commitment to fixing a ship. In practice, it moved faster than anyone's ability to prove where it actually went. That sounds like plain mismanagement. It was actually something stranger. In 2019, Urban Commons folded the Queen Mary's lease into a new entity called Eagle Hospitality Trust and took it public on the Singapore Stock Exchange, bundled together with more than 20 other hotel properties across the United States. This wasn't a hotel lease anymore. It was a stock ticker with a ship attached. Investors thousands of miles away, who had never seen the Queen Mary in person, now owned a financial stake in whether her hull got fixed. A real estate investment trust like that gets judged every quarter, on cash flow across an entire portfolio, not on one aging ship's bilge pipes. When a real estate investment trust is under pressure, the properties starved of investment first are the ones that do not move the quarterly number. And a permanently docked liner with a century of maintenance debt is exactly that kind of property. Then came 2020, and COVID-19 shut the hotel down entirely. For a business already running with almost nothing in reserve, that wasn't a temporary setback. It was the shock that removed the only thing keeping the whole structure standing: cash coming in the door every single day. In January 2021, Eagle Hospitality Trust filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, carrying more than $500 million in debt. A federal bankruptcy judge later froze assets belonging to Urban Commons co-founder Taylor Woods, ruling that he had knowingly made false statements to obtain a federal pandemic relief loan and then moved that money into another company. Every other hotel Eagle Hospitality owned found a buyer at auction. Nobody wanted the Queen Mary's lease. It went back to the city with no bidders at all. This wasn't just a company going broke. It was proof that, by the end, even people whose entire job was buying distressed hotels for a living looked at this one specific asset and said no. That's the moment Jim Towers climbed below deck with his flashlight. And that's where the bilge system came back into the story, this time as a full-blown emergency instead of a maintenance line item. His inspection found the ship's flood prevention infrastructure so degraded that city documents openly discussed the risk of capsizing. 22 lifeboats, each weighing 10,000 to 12,000 pounds, had corroded so badly their own weight was straining the equipment holding them to the hull. This was not routine wear from age. It was the ship, in an engineer's language, telling everyone that time had finally run out on nearly 60 years of deferred decisions. Long Beach was left holding direct control of the ship for the first time in over 40 years, and in July 2021, the City Council was handed a choice that had really been building since 1967. Keep preserving her for the next 25 years, an estimated $150 million to $175 million. Or scrap her or sink her as a reef, $105 million to $190 million. Preservation and destruction, for the first time in her history, cost roughly the same amount of money, which meant the decision was no longer really about engineering at all. It was about whether Long Beach still wanted her. While all of this played out, one man had already tried to warn everyone years earlier. Ed Prabonic had been the ship's outside inspector for years, and in 2019 he told the city, in writing, that without an immediate and serious infusion of money and manpower, the ship would likely become unsalvageable. Shortly afterward, he was let go. The city's own hired watchman had called the crisis 2 years before the bankruptcy judge froze anyone's assets, and almost nobody outside Long Beach heard about it until the ship was already at the edge of the fork the council would eventually vote on. None of this happened in a vacuum. The hotel's closure in May 2020 put staff out of work immediately. Servers, housekeepers, tour guides, all suddenly without a paycheck. Court filings from the bankruptcy listed roughly $1.3 million in lost deposits from ordinary people who had booked events on board, including a couple who had invested $2.3 million into their business relationship with the ship and recovered only $95,000 back, and a teenager who lost the deposit for an 18th birthday celebration that never happened. A 2019 economic study had estimated the Queen Mary supported close to 1,400 local jobs and nearly $94 million a year in economic activity for Long Beach. All of that sat frozen the moment the doors closed, not because the ship stopped existing, but because the business built around her did. A canceled reservation isn't just an inconvenience. For a family that had saved for a milestone birthday, or a couple planning a wedding around a ship they'd grown up visiting on school trips, it was a piece of their own personal history disappearing along with the company that was supposed to protect it. The brand, the name Queen Mary, never went anywhere. The system around her, the operator, the staff, the funding pipeline, collapsed completely. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction is the whole story in miniature. The city took the ship back in mid-2021 and chose to keep her. Roughly $45 million went into stabilizing the most urgent problems: hull corrosion, fire suppression systems that had not been meaningfully touched in decades, the beginning of real structural repair instead of cosmetic patchwork. The ship reopened in stages, with the hotel welcoming guests again by mid-2023. And unlike almost every year before it, going back decades, the Queen Mary started operating at a profit instead of a loss. That sounds like the happy ending. It isn't, not entirely. Saved is not the same as fixed. The $150 to $175 million preservation estimate from 2021 was never fully funded. The structural backlog that built up across 5 decades of operators didn't vanish because the city wrote one large check in one good year. It just stopped being an emergency and went back to being a slow, expensive, ongoing problem. Exactly the kind of problem that got ignored for 60 years the first time around, because it was never anyone's job for more than a few years at a stretch. And this is where the present catches up to the past. Her old speed rival, the SS United States, faced almost the identical choice in 2024. Keep paying to preserve a historic ship with no realistic path back to profitability, or let her go. Unlike Long Beach, the county that ended up owning her chose the second option. In 2026, the ship that once took the very speed record the Queen Mary held is being deliberately sunk off the coast of Florida to become an artificial reef, because restoring her honestly cost more than anyone was willing to spend. Long Beach made the opposite bet decades earlier, almost by accident, simply by refusing to let her go. Nobody yet knows for certain whether that bet holds for another 50 years or whether the next unfunded repair report just hasn't been written yet. So here's what the evidence actually shows and what it doesn't. Permanently mooring the Queen Mary in 1967 is what saved her from the scrapyard in the first place. But that same decision, no dry dock ever again, combined with a conversion that stripped out the internal defenses she was originally built with, is what guaranteed that keeping her would always be a fight against her own hull, not a one-time fix. Nobody single-handedly destroyed the Queen Mary. What destroyed her margin for error was 5 decades of operators who had every financial incentive to spend just enough to keep the doors open and the wedding bookings coming, and just enough city oversight to let them. That's the honest answer to who let it happen. Not one villain, but a system where no single owner ever had to pay for the whole problem at once. She wasn't sunk by the ocean. She was stranded by every decision that was supposed to save her. If you want more stories about the giants that carried millions of people and then quietly disappeared right in front of us, subscribe. Because there's a lot more like this one. Have you ever walked her decks, stayed a night on board, or watched the Queen Mary sitting in Long Beach Harbor from the shore? What did she look like to you?